Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you as we begin today's episode. I want you to think back to the first 10 to 20 years of your life. What experiences from that time most defined who you are today? Welcome to the follow up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. You know the old saying, never judge a book by its cover? It's supposed to warn us about the dangers of being too quick to judge someone or something, as first impressions can be made quickly, but often don't harbor the entire truth or depth. But come on, we all do it, don't we? Are they pretty, funny, inviting, standoffish, childish, smart, dumb, uppity, friendly, rude, honest? Some studies have shown it takes you 1/10 of a second to form a judgment about someone new that you meet. When judgments are made that quickly, how can you hope to avoid them? And there's a lesser known phrase that captures the dangers of this. First impressions die hard. If you're not careful, the snap judgments you make about someone can last a very long time, sometimes forever, which can close you off from ever experiencing the fullness of that person. And how heartbreaking that is, for you and for the other person. To never know the truth about someone, and for them to never be able to reveal their true selves to you. Now, I'll admit, this week's guest put me to the test. Gary John Bishop is what he calls an urban philosopher and a New York Times bestselling author of titles such as Stop Doing That Shit, Wise as Fuck, Love Unfucked, and his most well-known work, Unfuck Yourself. Now, I'll admit, I have seen these books for years and heard about Gary, and I've made a lot of judgments about who he is and what he stood for based on his works. More specifically, I've long been of the opinion that the four-letter word-laced titles of his books told me all I needed to know about Gary. Now, I'm not a prude, and I'm certainly no language saint. But I've told numerous people, if you can't make your point without swearing, then you're using those words as a crutch and as an attention-grabbing device. But I'll be damned if Gary's books didn't take the phrase, never judge a book by its cover, and throw it right in my face. You see, Gary's got a new book out called Grow Up, Becoming the Parent Your Kids Deserve. And when I agreed to the interview, I did so with a heavy dose of skepticism, admittedly. But trust me when I tell you, my expectations of this conversation and the conversation that actually took place could not have been more different. Because in this interview, Gary brings a depth and perspective about personal growth, blame, truth, and yes, even a little bit of parenting that left my first impressions of Gary and his work in tatters. Now, Gary wrote in his book, Grow Up, that it's a book for all human beings, regardless of their parental status, And the same holds true for this conversation and the wisdom Gary shares in encouraging us all to be someone who can ask a question that changes everything. I heard you say at one point that in the past, as you were reevaluating or just taking stock of your life, that you'd never seen the space that you took up in the universe. I would love to understand, what did you see when you came to that moment of realization of the space that you were taking up in the universe? What did you see?
No contribution. So, what I saw was somebody who was just sucking. Like I wanted people and the world and situations and circumstances. I wanted them all to come to me. And I wasn't generating anything in this life. Like nothing was going on. I wasn't broadcasting anything other than just my demands, my wants, my needs, my what I thought I deserved. Um, and then it's a kind of challenging place to find yourself because all too you can kind of fool yourself, like, oh well, I'm a good person, and because I wasn't this terrible man. But if I told myself the truth, and I think it started with some kind of question like, is the world a better place because I'm in it? And the answer was no, it's not a better place. Now you could go down a dark tunnel with that. I didn't. It just was a confront, like, no, and that needs to wake me up to something.
If you could expand on that, what do you do with that information in that moment? How do you not go down that dark path when that answer is a negative?
Right. Because like I talked about in this book, like I wasn't about making excuses for myself or to kind of like even blame myself. It was more like a moment of self-realization, but it was just like, this is not good enough. I'm not bringing it into the game. And it was kind of coinciding with, like, I'm wondering, well, why is life not going my way? Why are things not, unfolding for me? Why is and because I'm not a player in it. I'm an observer looking to get something out of it. Um, and quickly followed on with, well, what if I was a player? What if I was somebody who contributed? What if I was somebody who actually, you know, made something happen in this life, and started to show up? So then it became more opportunity. Then it became more like seeing the world in terms of, like I said, opportunity instead of like looking out there at a desert that's not giving me what I want.
How do you go from that and that realization to you've written many books, many best-selling books, and then eventually you get to this that we're talking about today, Becoming the Parent Your Kids Deserve, Grow Up is the title of the book. Gary, how do you get then from that moment or that realization, that wanting to contribute, to where you are now, where you're writing a book about becoming the parent your kids deserve, as the subtitle of your book is talking about this idea or notion of growing up? How do you
Right.
get there?
Um, I go into personal development for myself, right? Like I knew that there were I didn't know like knowledge. I experienced like some of those barriers in my life. Like I couldn't cause a breakthrough for myself here. I found myself kind of stuck there, particularly in relationships. I found myself stuck, like I'd nowhere. It seemed like there was nowhere else for me to go. And I think what most people do in that situation is they just look to acquire knowledge, and that was not going to do it for me. I needed something. I needed access to things. I needed doorways to new kind of methods of expressing myself. That at some level I think I knew was there. I think I knew like there was something that needed to come out, and I didn't know how to get it out. I'd become trapped in myself, if you like. So that was the initial pathway, and I took a really hard one. I took like the deep inquiry, um, which was years in the making, and it was very unforgiving. But my determination was at an all time high. Like I was literally sick of myself. I was like, this is nonsense. Like, is this the whole thing? Is this as good as it gets for me? And so I was determined to, no, it doesn't have to be. And then that led to me getting more and more into that, and the personal growth and development for myself. But then I started to notice like my brain was just lighting up like a Christmas tree. Like it was, I wanted to know more. I had questions, inquiries. I was doing seminars. I was doing, reading. Within a few years, I started along this process of becoming a professional. Like this was what I was going to do in my life. And again, started very small. But that process was probably the most transformational of all. That was the process of becoming somebody who can have these talks and lead these kind of talks. You quite literally have to disappear yourself. Like there has to be less and less and less and less you, and more and more and more the question. And again, that was years in the making, but I followed that pathway. I traveled all over the world. I was that person for many years, which led me into coaching people privately, which led me into, well, how can I give this away to people in a really simple and easy to access form? And writing books was the next challenge.
A couple things there. You said less of you and more of the question. What was that question? I think I may have missed it.
Yeah, well, it's being someone who can ask the kind of question that allows them to look at themselves in a different way. So it's being someone who can. So it's less. It's more like you're looking for things to open up with people. You want to
Mm.
open them up to something, which sometimes includes boxing them in. So you have to sometimes you need to box people in so that they can answer this question. And there's no right answer to the questions that I'm asking. I know this sounds kind of vague, but really this is about having people very often surprise themselves with their own answers. And I feel as if that's a big part of this. Like we fool ourselves for so long that when we finally confront the answers, they've been right in front of us the whole time, but we've spent so much time trying to fake it and make it and get past it. But those answers, those kind of truths, if you like, those are the beginnings of freedom for people.
So it is more a mindset, and even you wrote in the book, how did you come to believe what you've come to believe as true, in quotes?
Right.
I'll let you on to something. We don't deal in facts. We only ever deal in our view of facts until the view and the facts become one. That intertwined and coordinated explanation is what you end up being stuck with. I'm hearing from you, Gary, that this is not a specific question to ask, but it is a mindset of asking questions. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you settle on the truth, it doesn't feel like you've settled on the truth. It feels like it's the actual truth. So when you ask someone about their life, they'll tell you, well, this is the truth, not that they've settled on a particular one. And when you first start to question it with people, that entirely, people start to defend it, even though whatever truth they've come upon could have them trapped. And they might even realize that they're trapped in it, and they'll defend it. So you'll come across people who they're pretty miserable in their life, and they will defend that misery
Hmm.
because the alternative, and these are some of the things you have to break down with people, but the alternative is that everything they've lived to this point was based on one truth in an ocean of potential other ones.
Oh, I love that. I love that language there. Um, Gary, something else you said was as you were going through this process, the the acquisition of knowledge was not enough. Now we
Right.
see that a lot. We see just I want to learn more. I want to just like continuously be in this gathering information or gathering knowledge, but what was it that was not enough and what did you do beyond that?
Yeah. I think, this was many, many years ago. This was really before I began on my pathway to personal growth. I'd gone to, I think I was in my early 30s. And, I'm like, I'm just not, I don't feel like expressed and happy. I wouldn't have called myself miserable, but I didn't feel myself expressed and happy. And someone says, you go see a therapist. And it just didn't work for me. And I know therapy works for a lot of people, but it didn't work for me because I just felt as if they were kind of explaining what was going on with me, but it didn't get me anywhere. Like, I wasn't coming out of there like, oh yeah, now it all makes sense. I'm free as a bird. And it wasn't until that I'd kind of got into this notion of ontology, which is simply, the examination or the study of being. And it was the first time in my life, like, that I made sense. Like, it was like, oh my gosh, all of this makes sense now. And then that was, like I said, that was when my brain just started to light up, because with everything that I started, the inquiry was way more organic than academic. It was way more like this kind of series of self-realizations, as opposed to, I know tons of stuff about myself, but it's making no difference. It was almost like my experience of myself was unfolding. That was the only way I could describe it. It was like it was unfolding. And the more that I knew about myself, the less that I was attached to it, the less that I was, like, it was almost became this little spot between where I could disassociate myself with all that I had become. And I could watch it and witness it. And through, a little bit of practice and a little bit of mastery, start to take actions where I'm no longer defined by it. And that's where it got kind of wild and uncertain and a little crazy, but definitely like an experience of being alive.
Gary, how do you deal with that wildness, that uncertainty, that crazy? How do you get comfortable with that space and being,
Yeah,
as you said, detached from the things that have happened to you?
right. Um, there is a comfort in our pain. There's a comfort in it. You know it. One of the things that I say to people, I've said this many times in the past, but I've said everything you do is to justify yourself. And sometimes people hear that like some sort of like indulgence or self-justification. And really what it's saying is everything you do is to justify you continuing to be you. So everything that happens in your life, everything you're doing, everyone you're engaging with, you're coming at them from a certain perspective. And the results you get out of that justify this that you've become.
Mm.
And even though you might be really unhappy with that, or at least dissatisfied with that, like I feel as if there's more to me, I think there's more that I could be in this world. Um, you have to get your attachment to it. You have to get your, like, so if people are like, say, for instance, an example I hear a lot is people say, oh, I'm too nice or I'm too kind. Okay, but that serves a purpose. That's not just pulled out of the universe out of nowhere. Like that works for you at some level. And the question is, in what way does interacting with people that way continue to justify the you that you've become, which also includes what is it hiding and protecting? And so when you start to dig into that stuff, it's kind of like you start to see your own machine, you start to see your own little robot.
Mhm. Then what role does blame play, Gary? You talk
Yeah,
about this blame thing in the book.
right.
Do Is that a starting point? What role does it
I think
play?
it can be. I think that can be. I think it's a good place to start sometimes. Um, you cannot in any way separate yourself from whatever emotions are still hanging on to you from your past and keep your blame. So it's one or the other. Blame is infectious. I actually insist it's getting worse, right? I think in society, we're just way down the tunnel with blame. Like, we want to know who did it, right? As the boat's sinking, It's like, who cares? The boat's sinking. Um, and that's not mean. It doesn't mean to say people aren't accountable, people aren't responsible. It's not like that. Blame, there's such an emotional and visceral attachment to blame. It's not simply just they did it. It's the world that is when you're in it. And so there is a lot, and I address this in the book. There is a lot in a lot of personal growth and development work. People talk about forgiveness, and an awful lot of people can't get to that. They can't get to forgiveness. And the reason they can't get there is because they've never confronted blame and the damage that blame is doing in their life to them, to the people around them, who they've become, and the aftermath of it. And so I zero in on that and I say, if there was no blame, how easy would it be to forgive and, by its very nature of forgiveness, release yourself from this? And forgiveness is simple and easy when there's no blame. It's just simple and easy. So there was definitely something in this book that I felt as if I think it's an ignored phenomenon, blame. I think people talk about what goes on around blame, but I don't think they actually zero in and say, "Oh, here's what's happening here," because it can be very subtle. It's not always obvious. Sometimes people feel as if they're just explaining their life to you. They don't know that it's absolutely dripping in blame, right? They're just like, "Well, no, I'm just telling you what happened." So no, it's a great place to start, and I think a great question for people to ask themselves is, what would it take for me to let go of the blame? Whether you're blaming yourself or somebody else, you ask yourself, what would it take from me? Often people will say, here's what it would take from me. They would have to, and they immediately go to the other person. And I say, no, no, no. What would it take from you to let go of the blame? Right? If you never spoke to that person again in your life, what would it take from you? Because blame is simply punishing another. That's all it is. And just or you're blaming yourself, which is punishing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But they both result in the same thing. You're getting yourself kind of off the hook for how your life's going.
Let's explore the subtlety and the nuance of that a little bit, because you even mentioned it there, that blame is different from holding someone to account, keeping a level of accountability when someone has literally done something wrong.
Right.
What is that? Where is the gray blurred dividing line in your mind, Gary?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite simply, it comes down to this. People do what they do. Now what? And see, if you sit in that silence long enough, people do what they do. Now what? You immediately want to go back. Yeah, but you immediately want to go back. And that's what I said in the book. I said, blame is your anchor to the past. If you have someone who wants to free yourself from the past, that's the secret door right there. You attack it from there. But if you say, well, I'm holding them responsible. Okay, well, will you hold yourself responsible now moving forward for letting go of the blame? And again, that's something people don't want to do. They want to hold that time in their life responsible for how life is unfolding. And so it's even when people say, this is a more of a kind of philosophical track to take, but even when people say, I'm not responsible for what happened then, you might not be responsible for what somebody did, but you need to start being responsible for what you did with what they did. And that is where all the juice is. When it's not, even though people go through some really painful things in their past, like unbelievably painful, and I've coached people through some particularly horrendous things. You're still left with, okay, so when did that happen? 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. And what have you been doing with that since, though? Like, where have you been going in your head? How has that been showing up in your life? How is what happened and what you took from that? And you'll see, by the way, that what you took from it is what lives on. That's what continues. But we've got we've got the two things conflated, so we think it's the thing, when really it's what we took from the thing and conflated in our minds with the thing itself. And now we feel like we can't get free of it because we're solely looking at the times or the time when those items happened. So it's like we can't get free because I've no say in that. And I say, well, you've got a say in everything after. And that's when you start to realize, like, you now have a responsibility to handle what you took out of that.
Gary, what is it about blame that makes it so difficult to confront, as you just laid out?
Well, my view is we are absolutely tribal. So we function in groups. And even people that say they're loners, and I talk about that in the book, a loner is only a thing in the context of group, right? If there's no such thing as group, there's no such thing as a loner. It's only a contrast to group. So, an example I give in the book, or where I start to draw the line for people, is that, if you go back in time, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, your best shot at survival in this life was to exist in a group. And so, one of the fundamental concerns you would have to have as a human being back there, because if you weren't in a group and you were out in the wild, your chances of survival are very, very low. There was a
Mhm.
lot of nature back then that was, you were on the menu. Um, and so it became critical to be part of the group, but not only part of the group. And it's still the same, by the way. We're still very much drawn to this, but to be thought well of in the group. So people are still absolutely obsessed by that in communities across cultures, like all over the world, where people are still obsessed by being well thought of in the group. Why? Because it cements my position in it. So then that's when I believe this is when this notion of blame came up. It was like, when I blame, I deflect the attention away from myself. I get to point it at something or someone else to maintain my position in the group. Now,
Mm.
the kind of obvious part of that maybe isn't quite so obvious in society these days, in the day-to-day living of our lives, but there's no doubt about it. We still want to be well thought of, and we still want to avoid blame at all costs. Like, we avoid it. And you can even see it in society, because when people acknowledge that they did something, you've got this like litany of people just, fists under the chin, like, let me see if this is the real deal. Let me see whether they really mean it or not. Like, you're being judged full on, to see whether you're being real or authentic or genuine, or they can spot some little seam in there where you don't really mean it. That's how important it is. And if you don't pass muster, then you're out. And that whole notion of exclusion for us as human beings, why it's so important for us to be included. I mean, we punish people with exclusion. Like, as a society, we
Mhm.
punish people with exclusion. We'll put you in
Mhm.
prison. And if you don't behave there, we'll take you out of that group and we'll set you yourself. We'll put you in solitary confinement. You have to realize, like, solitary confinement for us as human beings, that's the ultimate. Like, that's about as close to death as it can get, to be on your own. That's how we're going to take you down. We're going to sit you there on your own. Well, if you bring that all the way back from solitary confinement, that's how we punish the people in our lives. We disconnect, we chop, we push them away, we take ourselves out of there, we withdraw, we withhold. All of that is forms of punishment in relationship to others, and it's everywhere in our lives.
So then how does this begin to manifest itself in our parenting? And you wrote in the book that this is a book really for all human beings, not just those who have the status of a parent or of being a parent or having a child. But
Right.
what does this notion of blame, how do these seeds of blame begin to manifest themselves when we become parents? And what effect does that have on us?
Well, my assertion in this book is we really only know how to parent in two ways. So we're either going to replicate our childhood. So whatever the things were that we took from there that we thought were good, we're going to try and replicate those with our children. What we'll notice is, using that example, it becomes a burden, right? Because I'm living a different life. I'm in a different era. I'm trying to raise these kids, in a whole different world now.
Right.
And so I'm holding myself to this standard. So often parents feel as if they're failing. I'm not getting it done, right? My mom and dad did a better job than I did, or my dad did a better job. And if only I could be as good as they were, because I've kept them up there on that kind of plinth. But the other way that we know how to raise children is exactly the opposite of how we were raised. So that's the two modes we've got. We're either going to do it the way we were raised or the opposite. Now, how does that, and usually, by the way, the opposite is a function of the blame that we apportion to those that raised us, right? So they did
Ah,
this. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. And the illusion is that somehow we think we're breaking some kind of generational chain. And what I really wanted to draw people's attention to is the generational chain is not circumstantial. It's not about changing the circumstances. Every generation that has ever been has tried to break a generational chain. And we fail because we don't recognize what the chain is. So, what's the chain? The chain is I'm either going to do what happened or I'm going to do the opposite of that. And how do I know that? Because that's exactly what your children will do. So, they're either going to raise your grandchildren the way you raised them or the opposite. Now, some people might say, well, if they raise them the way I raised them, surely that's a good thing. Yeah, but then the next generation might well just do the opposite. So I'll give you a very common example I've experienced over the years. I have people come to me and say, I never experienced love from my parents. Like they were never obvious about it. My mother was cold or my father was withdrawn and harsh. And I would say, okay, and how do you handle that with your own children? Oh, I shower them with love. I'm always loving on them, always telling them. And I say, well, how's that going down with your children? And they'll say, well, my oldest, it's great with it. The younger one kind of pushes back on it a little, doesn't really like it too much. Like they're kind of, I'm like, I know. So they're already going to do the opposite. And so the question is, well, what do you mean they're going to do the opposite? Well, they're going to say, oh, my mother or my father just showered me with so much love. I felt so controlled and pushed on. I'm not going to do that with my children. I'm going to give my children space and let them do their thing. And, I'm not going to be overflowing with the love because it was just too much for me with my mom. So that kind of twos and fro's back, generation to generation, back and forth, back and forth. And then we wonder why things are never changing because we don't understand the mechanism that has it persist in the first place.
one of my favorite bands is Fleetwood Mac, and the lyrics of The Chain are going through my head. I can still hear you saying we will never break the chain. But Gary, is there a way to break the chain?
Yeah, that is. There's things that I talk about in this book. There's so much about parenting that you have to kind of surrender to the process of your child. And we resist that a lot. We're trying to fight back against it or control it or shape it. You have to realize your children are going through something that they'll never go through again in their lives. If you take the first 20 years of a human being's life, they are quite literally being stamped by life, right? They're being stamped by life. They're going to hit 20. And people can't get their head around this, but it's true. For all intents and purposes, they're a done deal at 20. So 20 years, the first 20 years of a human being's life is to determine what is this thing, life, and who am I in it? And then after that, it's literally about proving it. Like I'm just going to prove that this is who I am in it and that this is life. So the first part I want people to get is get out of the way of the process. Stop being so stop thinking you can actually force this process to go the way that you think it should go because it won't, right? Because you don't know and you can't know what your child is going to take out of their childhood. And often it's the opposite of what you tried to put in. So whatever you think you tried to put in, they'll take the opposite out of that. So that is to say, we become marked by life and in ways that we don't even really understand until we're older. And so I want people to, first of all, get out of the way of that. Secondly, it's less about having them do X, Y, or Z, but actually for you as a parent to start to be a demonstration of some fundamental things that'll make a big difference in their life. Because that's another aspect that I want people to understand. Your children don't listen as much as they watch. So they
Right.
observe a lot. They're
Right.
seeing a lot, and they're coming to their own conclusions about what they're seeing. And that's really critical if you understand that. Like, this is why sometimes when people look back to their own childhood and that they might have sisters and brothers, and they're like, well, my childhood was great, but for my brother, it was terrible. Or for my sister, she couldn't stand my dad, but I loved my dad. Why? Because it's not the dad's just doing what dad does. The difference is they both had formulated a different conclusion about their father from a very, very young age and followed that pathway. And so then after that, it's about gathering evidence. I gather evidence about him and I'm listening for that and I'm noticing that and I'm confronting that and I'm, constantly either pushing back or aligning myself with that. Your children are going to do exactly the same with you.
Hmm.
So rather than being too wrapped up in, this kind of straitjacket of getting this job right, in this book, I talk a lot about it's more about what you're getting out of the way and who you are in it, who you authentically are in it. And that's definitely a big part of what I wanted people to understand. There's some fundamentals that you need to get your head around and start being that way in your own life, more as an influence rather than some controlled outcome.
Is that what you were referring to when you talk about the three heirlooms? I believe is how you reference it. Being loving, being
Right.
forgiving, and being someone of integrity. Those are not those are ways that you show up in the world, not lessons that you teach. Am I getting that correctly, Gary?
Yeah. See, I'll tell you what we noticed when we were young. How our parents handled life when it was coming at them. That's what we noticed. How they handled it. Did they retreat? Did they hide out? And so one of the things that I talk about in this life, and as a book rather, I think the most valuable thing you can ever teach your child and demonstrate to your child is how to love another.
Yeah.
How do you love somebody?
Yeah.
And truly authentically love someone. Now, some people are in great relationships. Some people are not. They're divorced and they're maybe seeing other people now. They're a new partner or whatever the situation is. But what I want to point to people is, can you love the person who you feel as if hurt you?
Hmm.
Because that's what would stick out.
Mhm.
That's what would shine. It doesn't make you a doormat. It doesn't make you, a victim to anyone. But can you still be a loving human being? So that I feel as if that's pivotal. The second one that I talked about in the book was clearly forgiveness. People think forgiveness is about letting somebody off the hook. It's actually it's actually it's the one way you can stop something dead in its tracks and pivot off. So when I talk about forgiving, I would say like that's probably my super strength, if you like, as a human being. Just because I forgive you for something doesn't mean to say I'm saying, well, you can just go ahead and do that to me again. No, when I forgive you, I'm saying I'm no longer willing to invest that kind of emotional energy in continually punishing you over and over and over. I'm not doing that. I'd much rather just say, you know what? I'm done with this. I forgive you. You did what you did. That's the way it goes. Obviously had an impact on me. But immediately I'm like, okay, what's next? It allows me to pivot into the future and into the present rather than dwelling back there on what should have happened, what could have happened, what they did, what they should have done back then. So that to me, that's critical. And then as you talked about, the last piece of that is integrity. That's being someone who honors what you said you were going to do. And again, as a parent, that's not always easy. A lot of
Hmm.
parents experience overwhelm and burnout and all that sort of stuff. But if you can demonstrate being someone of integrity, of showing up in life and behaving in a way that your word matters to you, like, because we make promises to ourselves all the time that we're never going to adhere to. But I assert to be loving, to be forgiven, and to function as someone of integrity. Again, that's not morality or some morality based goodness, but rather honoring your word to yourself. Those will not only clear up a lot of the mess in your life, but you'll be a walking, talking demonstration of the kind of tools that will be invaluable to your child long into their own life. And you actually give them something, or you demonstrate something to them that makes a real difference.
That sounds a lot like a way to release blame. Is that the case?
No, it's not. Those are all. It's all tied in, right? That's
Yeah.
why I talk at the beginning of the book. I'm talking about we're not going to do forgiveness here, at least not in the way that you think we would, because all too often, if you've had a troubled past, right? If you've had maybe a crummy childhood or whatever, um, there's really only two ways you can be with that. You're either going to be the victim and you're now recovering, right? Now I'm trying to get better and get over it and feel better about it and all that sort of stuff. Or you're the person who did it and now you're the repentant sinner. So that's the only two things you can do. You can't. There's no other way. But when you reach back into the depths of the book and you deal with that whole part there on blame, you actually don't have to be either of those. You don't have to be the recovering victim, and you don't have to be the repentant sinner. You can take ownership. You can be responsible. And you can start to see that forgiveness is one of the greatest gifts you'll give to yourself, even when you're forgiving another, because you're the one that gets free. You're the one that's like, you know what? This is not doing me any good. I don't know if it's doing you any good, but it's certainly not doing me any good. So I forgive you. You did what you did. And then I move, and then it again gives me that opportunity to pivot on. So, yeah, those things definitely all tie in.
Following up on something else you said, Gary, how does a parent get out of the way? What does that
Yeah.
look like?
There's a part of this book where I talk about the process of growing up, and I describe it as the three waves, where life comes in and leaves its mark and then recedes. And then, depending on the age that the young person is, it kind of leaves its mark and they move on from that. There's a lot of the trials and tribulations of being a parent that are directly related to whatever phase that child is in. But we don't think of it like that. We think it's circumstantial. Like, oh, a common one you hear is, oh, they're at this age where they're rebelling now. Oh, there's,
Mm,
and one of the things that we do as parents is whenever we see our child behave in a way that may be a little bit out of the ordinary, or sometimes a big bit out of the ordinary, we just immediately begin projecting into the future. We're already like, oh, this is a straight line to the state penitentiary. Like, this is just going to end up in disaster, right? And I want people to get, no, this is part of their phase. They're supposed to be here. And so you'll hear parents do this, they're being disrespectful. Yeah, they're supposed to be doing that right now. Like, this is their bit. This is where they are. They're at this part now. And I go into it in depth in the book where they're literally creating a disconnect between you and them. And often the only way they can really do that is by bringing you down, right? So they have to like critique you, bring you down, and justify the break because it's part of their evolution as a human being. Your job as a parent is to know that that's where they are. You don't even have to react to that. You can actually continue to be, again, using the three heirlooms that I talked about, continue to be loving, continue to be forgiving, and function with integrity. Like, we have certain ways we do things around this house, so we're going to do them that way. It's okay, but that's how it is. No upset, no stress, no strain, but being someone who's more like a guiding light rather than somebody that's trying to force the situation to go a certain way.
mm, mm. It's a very interesting way to look at it for sure, and very difficult, certainly
Yeah.
as a parent myself, absolutely. Gary, as we begin to kind of wrap things up here, I wanna go into one area that was very profound for me when I read your book. You lined out two things, two sort of I'll call them directives, and I want to ask about the second one. The first was speak like your words mean everything, and the second
Right.
was listen without making it mean anything. I have to know, what do you mean by listen without making it mean anything?
Well, rightfully, by the way, there's been a lot in society recently about people, the kind of language that people use and the way that people are speaking, and that words can do damage. Okay. Words can do damage. And we know that. And that's true. We do need to be responsible for what's coming out of our mouths and the way that it might impact others. Doesn't mean to say you're on eggshells. You're just being responsible for like what I'm saying and where that could go with people. Right. So to me, that's an increased awareness. I want to be more aware of the world around me. Okay. And the ways that that I could impact people. Sometimes, our terrible communication is simply just clumsiness. We're just not articulate. And again, I touch on this in the book. I say the evolution of society is the evolution of societal conversation. We're evolving as a society simply because what's evolving is what we're talking about. So you
Hmm.
need to be responsible for what's coming out your mouth. But the other side of that is ignored because it requires some sort of observation of self. And the other part of it is to be observant and responsible for how you listen. So you can't hold people eternally responsible for you being hooked, triggered, and offended. That doesn't let other people off the hook for what they say or don't say. But at the same time, you can't run around and have the world, succumb to your nuances. And I believe that's a lot to do with internal work and self awareness. And so there's an awareness of society with how I speak, but there's awareness of self and how I tend to listen. And because, we listen in very distinct ways, and we're usually listening for the same hooks. And this is where it all ties back. We're listening for the same hooks and triggers from our childhood. So we're still offended, hooked, triggered, angered, dismayed, sad at the same things from then, but it's a little hard to see because, again, we're very circumstantial. We're too busy looking at the circumstances.
What has to happen to begin to, I'll call it, take that bird's eye view of what we're seeing and experiencing and releasing that emotion from it, releasing that
Right.
past trauma from it and seeing it and hearing it for what it's worth? What has to happen there?
It starts with like doing that work on yourself. I wrote about this in my second book, actually, because a constant trigger for me growing up and into my adult life was that people don't care. And so if you're talking to me, I'm listening for that. So you could be saying whatever, and I'm just listening. Does this guy give a damn? Or does he not give a damn? And my response to if that hook came, if I feel as if you don't care, I'm angry about that now because you should care. Well, that's completely a throwback to my childhood. So what I
Hmm.
started to work on was maybe I should pay a bit more attention to what people are saying. Maybe I should start trying to get a sense of what their concern really is. Like, what are they really concerned for? And it keeps setting aside this notion of whether they care or not. It's irrelevant right now. What it made me is a much more curious conversationalist. I'm much more interested now in what's going on with you and how you're doing, rather than being so focused on whether it aligns with my, like I said, hooks and triggers and little subconscious nuances.
That's beautiful. I love that for sure. Gary, what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
um, oh boy, that is a good. So probably that one. Um, so I think one of the things that I would like to see people. Sometimes I'll say things on the internet, or I'll say something in a book, and people immediately want to argue back against it. The question that I would love people to ask me more would be, I can't see that. How could I do it? And I think if more people ask me that question, it'd be a lot easier to get the work out to people.
Repeat that question one more time. I missed it.
I don't see that I can do that, what you're suggesting, but how could I do it?
Ah,
So an awful lot of what I do with people, like you'll get this. People could be watching this interview and they'll be saying stuff like, well, you don't know my dad, and you don't know my mother, and you don't know my childhood. And I'd say to those people, no, all the exact same principles apply. All of them. Everything I've said applies to you. Oh, my father used to beat me every day. Okay, all the same principles apply to you. Now, what most people do is argue back with that rather than say, oh, I don't see how that's the case. How could it apply to me? How can I get through this with what you've said?
mm.
That's a way more empowering conversation to have rather than having to forge through it or forage through it for the next, 30 minutes until we eventually get to that point.
Gary, I think that, I mean, you gave me goosebumps with that answer. So I love that. I think that's a fantastic. Let's let that question just sit out there for people. I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you so very much for this conversation, Gary. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Perhaps my favorite thing that Gary said in this conversation is that one should strive to be someone who can ask a question that allows you to look at yourself in a different way. Exposing that, opening that up a little bit, which is also part of the ask then see approach to communication that I talk about in my book and as I've talked about here on this show, that S in C. Search yourself. Be someone who can ask a question that allows yourself to do some self-exploration, some digging into what it is you believe, how you came to those beliefs, and the reality that you have shaped around yourself that establishes your truth, but that is not necessarily the truth, capital T. The two are different. And isn't this one of the points that we get into conflict so much as human beings? When my truth clashes with your truth, and one of us spits out the line, well, if you can't see that, I don't know how I can help you. You look at your reality and the world that you have created based on your experiences and your perspectives and the things that you know to believe and to be true, and you judge others up against that version of your reality and your truth. And we proclaim our truths as the capital T truth and say, this is the way that it is. And we never invite that nuance in. So many things in life are simply not that black and white. It just rarely happens, friends. And I want you to take that away from this conversation. Gary wrote in his book, and I want to repeat it here. How did you come to believe what you've come to believe as true? I'll let you in on something. We don't deal in facts. We only ever deal in our view of facts until the view and the facts become one. That intertwined and coordinated explanation is what you end up being stuck with. Your truth is not necessarily the truth. And the more we can understand that and lean into those questions we ask ourselves and those questions we ask others, the more we can begin to communicate with each other across differences, across divides, across conflict, in ways that actually solve real problems. So I want to thank Gary for joining me here on the show and completely changing my perspective of him and his work. I want to make that clear that I judged Gary wrongfully. It wasn't right. And I so appreciate the conversation and the chance for a conversation that I got by having him here on the show. Please do Gary and I a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to the conversation and help Gary and I spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. Also, wherever you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops, and you can hear all the incredible guests that I have on, like Gary, each and every time a new episode is released. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always go to my website. It's michaelashford.com and reach out there. Or you can email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.